how do we learn to speak? And, what does our accent actually say about us? Seems pretty simple, maybe something we don't think much about. But what if I told you that even a child's accent, something so basic, could become this real battleground for understanding neurodivergence, specifically autism? Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really crucial and honestly often overlooked debate. Our mission is to unpack how one particular study from way back in 1994 by Simon Baron-Cohen ended up shaping how autism was understood for decades. And, crucially, how that understanding is pretty strongly contested by autistic communities themselves. We're going to try and show how an academic idea, once it gets established, can be incredibly sticky, affecting everything from how diagnoses happen to just everyday ideas about what autism is. So we're digging into some critical analysis of this older research, really focusing on how Baron-Cohen's work, especially this 1994 accent study, kind of set a template for seeing autism through what our sources call a deficit lens.
This deep dive should give you a shortcut to understanding this really important, sometimes kind of uncomfortable conversation. Okay, let's unpack this. We're going back to 1994, a study that, might look harmless enough at first glance. But as we'll explore, our sources argue it really laid the groundwork for a view of autism that's still very much with us.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? And maybe a bit unsettling how one academic paper, which our sources call an amber specimen, like it's frozen in time, can lock in this specific deficit framing.
Yeah.
And even though it's old, that way of thinking still echoes through research today, through policy. It's this lens that tends to define autism mainly as, a deviation, something different from normal, instead of just a different way of being.
Okay, so let's get right into that 1994 paper. The title was, Do Children with Autism Acquire the Phonology of Their Peers? What was the main idea there? What were they trying to test about accents?
Well, the core hypothesis was pretty straightforward. They suggested that if autistic children held onto their mother's accent, didn't pick up their peer's accent, this was basically a failure. A failure to sort of assimilate into their peer group. It worked from this big assumption that there's this inherent normal drive for all children to identify with their peers and change their speech to match. And anything else, any deviation from that path, was seen as, a lack, a problem.
That is a strong assumption, isn't it? That there's only one way kids should connect with peers, and it shows up in their accent. How does the analysis we're looking at describe Baron-Cohen's general viewpoint as it comes across in that study?
It's quite revealing, actually. The source material points out how consistently terms like normal children are used, as the benchmark, the control group. And from that perspective, autism wasn't just seen as a condition, it was defined against that normality. It became a deviation measured in deficits, something that always needed to be fixed. So keeping your mom's accent wasn't just keeping an accent, it was framed as a deficit in social drive, a failure of assimilation, almost like a stubborn refusal to become normal. It wasn't seen as maybe a different way of processing language or connection, just falling short.
And that interpretation, as our analysis points out, can have a real personal impact. It's quite moving, actually. The author of the critique we're drawing from, who identifies as a gestalt language processor, mentioned feeling a personal sting from that specific view. Because for her, keeping an accent that wasn't assimilated wasn't a deficit at all. She sees it more like a loving remembrance of my ancestry and my grandmother. It's about connection, history, not something missing. That really flips the script, doesn't it?
Completely. It repranks the whole thing.
But here's what's really striking. What that 1994 study seemed to just miss, even in its own data. The study actually found that a huge majority, 83% of the autistic kids they looked at, did keep their mother's accent. But they presented this overwhelming result as a failure. Now, for anyone who knows about gestalt language processing, GLP, well, that's not failure, is it? It's pretty much exactly what you'd anticipate. Can you tell us a bit more about GLP? Why is that 83% number so important here?
Absolutely. This is such a key point. So GLP, think of it like this. Instead of learning language word by word, some kids, especially many autistic kids, acquire it in chunks, like intact scripts or whole phrases, almost like hitting record and playing back a whole soundbite. For these gestalt processors, keeping that original script intact, the accent, the intonation, the rhythm, everything is part of the whole package. It's the gestalt. So expecting them to immediately start chopping up these scripts to sound like their peers, it's often just not how their language develops, especially early on. It might happen later or maybe never quite in the same way. So what Baron-Cohen called a deficit was actually fidelity. It was accuracy. a faithful reproduction of the language input. It's like looking at a perfect copy and saying it failed because it wasn't an original interpretation.
Fidelity versus failure. That's a really powerful way to put it. And what makes this even more, well, puzzling, as our source notes, is that GLP wasn't some brand new idea even in the mid-90s. People like Prezant and Peters were already writing about echolalia and formulaic speech back in the mid-80s. These are core parts of GLP. Yet, Baron-Cohen, despite being hugely influential, if you look today, he hasn't authored a single paper focusing on GLP. What does that suggest, according to the critique?
Well, it certainly raises a big question, doesn't it? It's pretty astounding that someone who has had such a massive impact on how we think about autism has apparently no published work and maybe seemingly no real curiosity about how a large number of autistic people actually develop and use language to build this whole empire based on deficit and failure without really engaging with research that already offered a different, potentially more validating explanation for the exact same observations. It kind of suggests the conclusion might have come first. That the framework was already set. Autism is the opposite of neurotypical rather than a genuine exploration of autistic communication itself.
That is a strong point. And this critique, it goes even deeper than just questioning one study's methods, right? This isn't just about overlooking GLP. It raises serious questions about the whole foundation, the whole mindset behind some of this research. The source argues that the 1994 hypothesis actually reflects an imperial mindset. That sounds pretty strong. Can you unpack that connection for us? How does accent connect to colonialism in this critique?
It is a very strong comparison, and it's meant to be provocative to make us think. The critique draws a parallel. It suggests that labeling accent retention as a failure echoes how historically colonized people and their cultures were often policed and judged against a dominant standard. In that kind of imperial mindset, anything different from the dominant norm language, accent, custom, social behavior wasn't just seen as different. It was often seen as wrong, as insubordinate or disorderly, something needing to be disciplined or corrected. So this critique frames the pathologizing of autistic voices, autistic ways of being, as a kind of echo of that colonial impulse to standardize and control deviation from a presumed norm.
Wow. That's a heavy parallel. So the source isn't seeing this research as just, objective science. It's positioning it as a continuation of imperial policing by other means. Autism becomes like a territory to be surveyed and subdued, and things like keeping the wrong accent or communicating differently are viewed almost like a threat to that established order. The source is really explicit. This is not science. It is conquest by another name. It's arguing that it's about enforcing a certain idea of normal using the authority of science.
Precisely. It's a critique of power dynamics wrapped in scientific discourse. And this mindset, according to the source, leads to what it calls a vile calculation. It points to this example, an image linked to a paper titled, "Autism Test Could Hit Math Skills." For the author of the critique, this just lays bare a really disturbing instrumental tolerance. The idea that autistic people, their neurotype, are maybe tolerated or even valued, but only so long as we provide utility to the empire of numbers. The chilling implication is that if autistic traits don't offer some clear, measurable benefit to the mainstream neurotypical world, then their value, even their right to exist authentically, is questioned. It's a very stark utilitarian view of human worth.
So this deficit framing we've been talking about, it wasn't just in that one 1994 paper. Our source really emphasizes the astonishing consistency of Baron-Cohen's Autism Research Centre, the ARC, from ideas like mind blindness back in the 80s and 90s to later concepts like empathy deficit and the extreme male brain theory. The core message, the framing of autism, is fundamentally about lack, about failure, about deviation from the neurotypical norm. That hasn't really changed since that 1994 blueprint, has it?
No, it's been remarkably consistent. That's one of the main points the critique makes. His work over decades has consistently defined autism by what's perceived to be missing compared to neurotypicals. Mind blindness suggested an inability to grasp others' thoughts. Empathy deficit claimed a lack of empathy. The extreme male brain theory framed autism as an exaggerated version of male cognitive patterns. Each of these major theories, as the source lays out, reinforces this central idea. Autism as a deviation, a failure to meet neurotypical standards, rather than seeing it as a different kind of neurological setup with its own profile of strengths and challenges.
And this consistent output, this huge body of work over 750 papers, has built what the source calls an academic empire. It's not just publications. It's described as academic architecture. It literally shapes how governments, universities, policymakers around the world understand and define autism. But then there's this massive contradiction, right? His theories, according to the source, are often reviled by the very people they claim to describe. Well, Within autistic communities, his name and these theories have become almost synonymous with pathologization, assimilation, and erasure. How does that happen? How can something be so dominant academically and yet so rejected by the community it's about?
Well, that's really the heart of the conflict this critique exposes, isn't it? On one hand, the academic and policy worlds often look for clear deficits, things that can be measured and potentially fixed or normalized. Baron-Cohen's framework provides that. It's a clear, though arguably narrow narrative that aligns with many societal assumptions about what normal development looks like. So it gets cited, it influences policy. But on the other hand, for many autistic people and their advocates, this narrative just doesn't ring true to their lived experience. It feels alienating. They feel it doesn't describe them, but rather diagnoses their way of being as fundamentally flawed. They see it as pushing for assimilation, for hiding their true selves, and basically pathologizing the natural differences. So you get this huge gap between the academic influence and the community reception. It really highlights a deep disconnect in understanding.
And the source uses some really strong historical comparisons to hammer this point home. It compares Baron-Cohen's influence not to, say, celebrated medical reformers, but quite startlingly, to figures like colonial administrators, phrenologists, eugenicists, people whose work, the source claims, was adored by governments and elites because it gave intellectual cover to control. Why make such provocative comparisons? What's the underlying message there?
It's definitely intended to provoke critical thought about power. The argument isn't about direct equivalence in action or intent, but about the function of the knowledge being produced. The source argues that, like those historical figures, Baron-Cohen's work, perhaps unintentionally, provided a kind of intellectual justification for exerting societal control or normalization pressure on a specific group. Phrenologists use science to justify racism. Eugenicists use science to justify controlling reproduction. The critique suggests that Baron-Cohen's deficit model provides a scientific basis for defining, categorizing, and ultimately trying to fix autistic people to fit a neurotypical mold. Again, it's less about accusing malice and more about highlighting how even seemingly objective scientific work can end up reinforcing societal biases and power imbalances, often harming the group being studied.
That brings us right back to language, doesn't it? Language is this deep inheritance and maybe even sometimes a form of resistance. Our source makes the point that assimilation is never innocent. It's always a kind of demand for belonging enforced through national and linguistic norms.
Yeah.
And Baron-Cohen's view, in that context, paints language difference as a defect, when maybe it's something else entirely. How does the source suggest we rethink language and accent, particularly for neurodivergent people?
Yeah, the critique really pushes for a complete shift in perspective, away from seeing language differences as problems to be solved, and towards seeing them as valuable expressions of identity, culture, personal history. It challenges that idea that there's only one right way to sound, one correct way to communicate, and everything else needs fixing or assimilating. For many autistic people, their specific way of speaking, accent, intonation, phrasing, it's part of who they are neurologically. It's tied to how they process the world and express themselves authentically.
And to give us a different way of looking at this, the source brings in the work of Isaac Ani Nuglub. He's a Nigerian professor of English language and linguistics. His book, Learn English, Son, explores language as culture, inheritance, and clarity. And he's writing from Nigeria, a place where, over 500 languages coexist. What can we learn from his perspective when thinking about autism and language?
Nuglub's work offers a really refreshing lens. He really champions viewing language diversity as a strength, as something inherently valuable within communities.
Yeah.
In a place like Nigeria, with so much linguistic richness, the whole idea of one single correct accent or way of speaking just naturally becomes more flexible, right? He sees language not just functionally, but as this living container for culture, for history, for personal meaning. And when you take that perspective and apply it back to the autistic child holding onto their grandmother's accent, suddenly it's not a failure to socialize. It becomes this beautiful act of keeping love alive, carrying memory in their voice, sustaining stability through sound. It's about connection, not deficit.
That's a much richer picture. And it sounds like gestalt language processing, GLP, fits really neatly into that frame, doesn't it? Language is these whole scripts, embodied memory.
Yeah.
It's miles away from the deficit model.
Exactly. Seen through Nuglub's kind of lens, GLP isn't a problem. It's a powerful example of language as inheritance. The child isn't failing to chop up sounds. They're faithfully holding onto and using language in its complete, often emotionally charged original form. This understanding turns those perceived deficits into acts that are deeply meaningful acts of continuity, self-expression, fidelity. It honors their relationship with language instead of demanding they break it to fit in.
Okay, so this isn't just looking back at old research for history's sake. This really matters right now. Our sources point out that this deficit framework, the one kind of preserved in amber in 1994, is often still the first thing people find when they search for information about autism today. Why is that persistence especially worrying now in the age of AI and massive information systems?
This is where it gets really critical, I think. With the explosion of AI-driven research tools, things like Scholar, Consensus, Gemini Baron-Cohen's sheer volume of work gets amplified. These systems often equate citation count with authority. Volume is mistaken for authority, and authority becomes canon in. So these older, deficit-focused perspectives get prioritized, recycled, presented as the established view in AI summaries and searches. It makes it incredibly hard for alternative voices, for neurodiversity-affirming perspectives to cut through the noise. The old biases are essentially being automated and served up as current fact.
That is a really concerning thought. And these framings, boosted by AI, they don't just stay online, do they? They seep out. They shape public policy, they influence diagnostic criteria, they guide intervention models, they feed into everyday prejudice. Can you give some real-world examples? How does this weight of one man's empire of deficit, as the source puts it, actually affect people's lives?
Oh, absolutely. Think about a parent going for a diagnosis for their child. They might hear professionals talking about how their child lacks theory of mind based on those older ideas. Or teachers might see an autistic child using gestalt language, repeating phrases, and interpret it as being inflexible or rigid, not understanding it's a valid language development path. Diagnostic criteria themselves often still lean heavily on identifying social communication deficits. These aren't just words on paper. They become the lens through which autistic people are seen, evaluated, and sometimes treated. That weight of one man's empire of deficit becomes the background noise of culture, as the source says. It echoes so much it starts to sound like the only truth, shaping how society interacts with autistic individuals, impacting self-worth, access to the right support, just overall well-being.
So, connecting this to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
especially now with AI, this deficit thinking isn't just some historical footnote.
Exactly. It's being actively amplified, automated, redeployed. That makes it more vital than ever that we really look critically at where these ideas came from and challenge their ongoing power.
What this deep dive really shows us, I think, is something quite powerful. That the very things Baron-Cohen's framework tended to label as pathology, like keeping an accent, that fidelity to dialect that's precisely where strength, heritage, and a sense of belonging can actually be found for many autistic people. It's not failure to assimilate. It's maybe, as our source powerfully argues, an autistic refusal of assimilation, a quiet act of preservation.
And the author of the critique makes it personal and very clear. Her own choice not to change her dialect, her accent. She doesn't see it as being broken or having a deficit. For her, it's a remembrance of my grandmother, a continuity I choose to honor. That simple statement just shifts the whole frame from sickness to strength, from deficiency to dignity.
It really does. And it points towards needing a new canon, as the source calls for it, one that actually hears autistic voices in their own unique way, that values fidelity as a form of belonging, and understands that sometimes refusal isn't a deficit. Refusal can be the strongest form of survival, of asserting who you are. So thinking about all this, what does it mean for you listening? It brings up a pretty big question, I think. In a world that's more and more shaped by algorithms, by dominant stories, what parts of your own identity, your own unique accent, maybe literally, maybe metaphorically, are you feeling pressured to change, to assimilate? And what might it really mean for you to refuse?